Hi, my name is Steve Rozenboom. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for Holy Cross Medical Center. And my purpose today is to share with you the results of the finance review at the board meeting held on January 27th. The board meeting on the 27th was was the first board meeting since our November meeting, so we combined November and December operating results in the overall financial review. November was a okay month, fairly solid volume-wise. We did have a positive operating income of about $25,000. December, on the other hand, was not quite as good from a financial standpoint. We incurred a loss of about $380,000, mostly due to COVID-related expenses, which I'll talk about in more detail in a few moments. As I mentioned, volumes in November were pretty steady, pretty consistent with our budget and what we see from a seasonal perspective, with the one exception being inpatient admissions. They grew quite a bit. We've been lagging our budget on inpatient admissions actually since the pandemic began back in March. So we had seen a steady increase from June through November, but in December those volumes dropped off dramatically. We did see an increase in our observation days, which typically does work kind of inversely with our inpatient admissions. So while inpatient admissions were down in December, we did see that increase in observation days. Our overall outpatient activity remained very high. We've been in excess of 5,000 outpatient discharges each month for the past 3 months. We had never exceeded 5,000 outpatient discharges prior to that. Back in October. But we have our annex open 5 days a week, so we're seeing a lot of COVID swab testing taking place at the annex. Plus in December, we started our vaccination clinics, our vaccination pods. So those two things combined have led to a significant increase in our overall outpatient volumes. Lab results have been very high as well. Certainly in November, they did fall off a little bit in December. Replaced as some of the COVID testing was being replaced with the vaccinations that were being done at the pods. Imaging studies were pretty steady in November. In December, they were down quite a bit, partly due to the holidays, partly due to other factors, largely the governor's order on limiting our patients in the operating room area. So surgical volumes were not quite as high as we've seen in the past. In fact, over the past 4 or 5 months, we've only averaged about 180 surgical visits per month. Typically in a year without COVID, we average about 240 surgical visits per month. So you can tell there's quite a significant drop in our overall surgery volumes, which also impacts our imaging, to some extent our lab, but probably more so in the imaging area with diagnostic x-rays, CT scans, MRIs. We did see lower volumes in the emergency room also in December, partly because some of those volumes were going straight to the annex for the swab testing. We had 978 ED visits in December, which is probably close to normal, maybe a little bit below pre-COVID levels. So since most of that testing is taking place at the annex, we don't see that through the ED any longer. Clinic visits were also down a little bit, again, impacted greatly by the holidays. Between Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's, we see fewer visits quite a bit as patients are scheduling other things during those holiday periods rather than seeing their doctor. The resulting gross revenues from the visits that we did have in November and December showed a steady decline from where we had kind of peaked in October. Not significant, to maybe $500,000 per month decline, certainly below what we had budgeted last April. But those declines in the gross revenues were offset by steady and maybe slightly increasing net revenues. So even though our gross revenues went down, our net revenues kind of went up, and it's mostly due to improvement in our collection amounts and reduction in our contractual allowances. When we have more current collections, We do a better job working with all of our payers in ensuring that we're getting what we're supposed to be paid based on the contract. The difference between gross revenue and net revenue is what we've contracted or what Medicare, Medicaid decide to pay, which is a fixed amount versus what we might charge. So I hope that's not too confusing. I've talked about it several times in previous videos, but it's always worth remembering. We also had additional other income that's not directly related to patient experiences. Most of that other income has come from our cafeteria in the past, but recently, certainly since July, we've been, well, excuse me, not July. July is when the GRT tax was implemented. We started receiving funding from the gross receipts tax in September. And we've been averaging about $115,000 to $120,000 a month from the gross receipts tax. That goes into our other income. Another part of our other income is recognition of funding received from the provider relief funding that we got early in the pandemic. Most of that was received in April and May. We received the cash but did not recognize the income until more recently. And what we're doing is recognizing a portion of the income that would be attributable to the direct COVID expenses, or about half of those direct COVID expenses. As a critical access hospital, it's still unclear with the guidance that the federal government has provided on how much of that we'll be able to claim, simply because we have claimed those expenses on our cost report. We cannot claim them in both places. We cannot claim them on the cost report and also as an expense to offset the funding received from the provider relief funding. So it's still unclear exactly what amount, if it's included on the cost report, can we still include a portion of that separately, because the cost report doesn't reimburse us 100% of cost and is certainly only being included for the Medicare portion of our revenues, which is less than half of our revenues. So once more clear guidance comes out, we'll have a better picture of what we can claim as income and make adjustments on that going forward. As I mentioned earlier, November and December revenues were a little bit up and down, but where the real change took place was in our overall operating expenses. Salaries and wages for both months were significantly higher than budgeted. We continue to have higher levels of FTEs in anticipation of any COVID inpatient spike that we might have. That's part of the reason why we received the provider relief funding, is so we could maintain our FTE levels, not reduce our FTEs, and be prepared if in fact a surge takes place. We have been fortunate. We haven't had a large surge. We've had a couple of minor surges, one right after Thanksgiving, one after the Christmas and New Year holiday, but nothing significant like a 50% increase or something like that. They were very minor surges, and it was compared, the surges that we had were compared on our actual history with COVID, not on what our actual inpatient history has been. We also have high amounts of contract labor. Much of that is for the COVID-related activities that we have. We have more nursing staff to cover not only our inpatient areas, but also to cover our emergency department, help staff our annex, and help staff our vaccination pods. We also have higher number of people working in our respiratory therapy area. Some of the significant COVID symptoms are respiratory therapy related, so breathing. We haven't had to intubate anyone, but we have had to have additional breathing support devices used, and we have to have qualified staff respiratory therapists to monitor and implement those interventions. The other area with significant higher expenses is in other purchased services. The main culprit there is our lab testing fees. In December alone, we had over $260,000 of lab testing fees directly related to the COVID swab tests that we completed in November and December. As I mentioned earlier, in November we had a $25,000 positive operating income, and in December we had a $380,000 loss, mostly driven by the increased expenses of $6.5 million. That was our total expenses for the month. We had budgeted about $5.8 million. And what we had in direct expenses for COVID was $516,000. So you can see that we had significant higher expenses, but primarily related to our COVID preparation. Below the operating income line, we also have another income line for donations, contributions, and also that's where our mill levy income is. And we've been well below our spending on mill levy over the past several months. Some of that's kind of on purpose because the mill levy that we had expired in June of this year. It was reauthorized through the general vote, and we appreciate the support of the community in reauthorizing that mill levy. But we will not see money from that reauthorization until probably November of next year. So the $1.5 million that we have left to spend in the mill levy needs to tide us over for that next 18 months until we get to November. We have been spending some additional mill levy money through various projects. Some of these projects take more than 1 or 2 months to complete, and we don't bill the county, or we don't request the money from our mill levy account from the county until we have the project completed. So we just request a single authorization instead of piecemealing it over time. Our accounts receivable and accounts payable statistics are both well within industry benchmark standards, so we're very comfortable with where they are. Our total cash has been declining gradually over the past several months, and particularly in December. In December is when we pay when our malpractice premiums are due. In past years, because of the shortage of cash, we've always paid those premiums on a month-to-month basis. Doing that also results in an interest charge from month to month. And when that bill is $1.7 million, that interest charge builds up pretty quickly. So this year, since we did have the cash on hand, we elected to pay the entire $1.7 million premium in December, which saves us $40,000 of interest expense over the course of the year. So that was one contributing factor. Also, when you look at the calculated amount of days of cash on hand, it's usually based on a 3-month average of your operating expenses. With the significantly higher expenses in December, that 3-month average went up quite a bit. So the combination of paying down that malpractice premium of $1.7 million combined with a higher average monthly operating expenses drove our days of cash on hand from about 96 down to 82. Still a strong total, but also keep in mind a portion of the provider relief funds may have to be repaid back to the federal government. As it stands today, the Medicare accelerated payments that we received of $7 million still have to be repaid. There is some activity taking place that may result in some or all of that being turned into a grant, and we're hopeful that that's the case. But if it's not, we will have to repay the entire $7 million. There were just a couple of other updates in the finance realm discussed at the board meeting. There was one capital equipment request to replace 2 ultrasound machines that we have in the hospital. Their serviceable life expired in 2018, but we've been able to get parts when we've needed them for the past couple of years. But now parts are being very difficult to find. So we did have the board approve a request to buy 2 demonstration GE units. So they're brand new. They've been used for some demonstrations, but they have the latest technology. And by purchasing a demonstration unit, we're able to save about $100,000. So the total cost of the 2 new ultrasound machines that was approved by the board is just short of $230,000. We also had the board formally approve an expansion of our vmware network. This is a network that's used primarily to allow people to dial in from remote locations, whether it's from their home, whether it's from another hospital, wherever they might be. It allows them to dial into our system securely and access the different programs that they might need to use within our network. With the advent of the pandemic, more and more of our employees are working from home. if not full-time, on a regular basis, 1 or 2 days a week, to avoid interactions inside the building. And we just have an overall greater need for those remote connections. So the board approved the additional 100 licenses for this system, which effectively doubles what we had at a cost of about $44,000. And the last thing I'd like to discuss or share with you is the bad debt relief project that has been led by Reverend Pamela Shepard. This has been primarily from the faith community, but as information has gotten out, we have also received donations from private individuals, but most of it has come from the faith community. This has grown over the past 3 years, starting out with a modest couple of $1,000s in 2018, and that allowed the relief of about $80,000 of older bad debt. It grew the next year. I don't recall the specific donations, but we relieved about $240,000 in 2019 of bad debt. This year, calendar year 2020, the faith community raised enough funds to relieve $1.85 million of bad debt. And the way that's calculated is if we were to sell our bad debt to a third-party company, and a lot of hospitals do this. We've not done this in the past. We've not sold it to a third-party company. But other hospitals do, and they get about 3 to 5 cents on the dollar for the bad debt that they sell. That's how we calculate the bad debt to be relieved within our community. Whatever, if a dollar is donated, we're going to relieve about $30 worth of bad debt associated with that $1 that's been donated. As I mentioned, the total for this year was $1.85 million. It's a significant amount of bad debt. We've received numerous thanks from patients that have received the letters relieving them of their bad debt. We even had one patient whose bad debt was relieved, and she was, but just for one of 2 accounts. She was so excited that her debt was relieved that she did have enough money to pay off the balance of her remaining bad debt on the other account, and very thankful that the faith community and the organization worked together as partners to do this. Lots of good stories to be had on the Bad Debt Relief Project, and we really thank Reverend Shepard and the entire faith community in the Taos area for pushing this program forward. That's all I have for today. Thank you very much.